Celebrity allure of entrepreneurship, many exceptional entrepreneurs remain shadowed. Here, I team up with these hidden talents to unveil their challenges and successes. Dive in with me to unearth entrepreneurial gems, learn from our experiences, and get educated. This is epic having you on the show. I really appreciate you being here. For those of you who wouldn't know Curt, but you'll see it in his bio, ex-commander of SEAL Team 6, transitions out of that into some business consulting, and then into Broadway Fund, which you guys are doing. And I know it's been a harrowing ride. Like Curt and I have been best friends for, 12, 15 years. And dude, it's awesome having you here. So how's things going? How's life? What's new?
No, it's an honor and privilege. As you know, everything's always new, always highly dynamic and great adventure.
So I don't know if, we could chat about anything that's on your mind these days, but I'm always curious, especially for, people who are listening in that may have been new to business, that may be new to business and were in another career previously, whether it be working for a company or whatever, your experience of transitioning from the Navy SEALs into owning your own business. I'm interested in your perspective. I know we've talked about it before, but people might think like, it's cakewalk doing business, coming from Navy SEALs. But we've talked about that before. You've admitted to business being as harrowing potentially, or in a different way than the Navy SEALs. So,
yeah, I think it's a great question and a great point. I think there's probably three things that come to mind. First is whatever skill set you've built in whatever domain. For me, it happened to be coming from the SEALs and going into business. Whatever skill set you've built, you eventually get back. And so if you have, a lightsaber and an incredible skill set and where you are, you'll eventually get it back. My experience is that you don't get to use it until you can put on the white belt again and start anew, right? So you can learn all anew a new language, or learn all anew the perspective of the new domain you're entering, right? My metaphor from the SEALs was we'd done a ton of training in the desert, and then we went to Thailand and working with the Thai SEALs, and we showed up with 70, 80 pounds of body armor, gear, and equipment, which is all the things that we would carry into the desert. And within about a kilometer, which is a humiliating small distance, like we were all completely sweated through all of our water. And the Thai SEALs in the domain, were literally running with like one magazine and a chicken slung to their back, and they were completely free and oriented to the terrain. And so for me, it was bringing that skill set. We had incredible skill set. We didn't adapt to the terrain, and so we couldn't actually effectively use that skill set. Now, once we adjusted to the terrain, then we get that skill set back. So to me, it's when I entered the business world, I knew I spoke English, but I was also very clear I didn't speak the language of business. I didn't know what a point was. I didn't understand how the deals executed, and I didn't understand any of those pieces. And so I went to study in the same way I'd love to learn in the SEALs. In the SEALs, you'd have deep periods of immersion where you'd work with the best jumpers in the world for 3 weeks, and then the best shooters in the world for 3 weeks, and the best divers in the world for 3 weeks. And so you'd have this massive differential gradient between here's a skill set they had and here's a skill set we had, so we could learn really rapidly. And then you had to be able to switch from I'm fully surrendered to the expert so I can learn from the expert, and then we had to, as soon as they left, now teach and lead, right? And if you couldn't toggle back and forth between those two, you couldn't make it as a SEAL. So we did the exact same thing in the business world. I went to LSE, the best in the world that I could find for policy, for a 3-week block. Then went to NYU for the best in the world in finance, HSA for some of the best in the world in marketing and branding. And the differential that allowed me to learn the fastest, the community that program had was 45 different countries. And so I knew I had a very limited set from my experience, either American or any of the countries we'd worked with. And so building a broader community was also a crucial component. And so I would say for anyone ready to make the transition, one, I don't think you can fully live your life if you're not lifting, Dwayne, what you and I have talked about is your Thor's hammer, right? If you're not doing the thing that's yours to do, then everything is more difficult. And if it's not mine to do, it's infinitely heavy. And so I feel like, for me, the entrepreneurial journey was the only way, because it was the path I was called toward. It was, here's what I'm called to next. And then once you have that calling, is how do I put on a white belt to learn everything I can about that domain, so that I can bring all the learned expertise and skill sets from other domains to that front.
So, you know what, you spoke about something that's, a bit near and dear to me, which is immersion, and working with the SEALs, and, spending 3 weeks with jumpers, spending 3 weeks with snipers or shooters, as you said it. Can you just talk about that a little bit? Whether it be from the SEALs, from your business experience, both. I know you also have 5 kids, which, I mean, your life is insane. I don't think people can grasp how on fire you are. And, over this podcast, and hopefully, I think we have lots to talk about, and we certainly won't cover it all in this one, but you could maybe just chat about this immersion thing, because to me, immersion is critical to learning. And I see so many people, and I did it myself. You dabble until you get your ass handed to you so many times. It's like, I learned most of my skills by not being the crispiest chip in the bag, but just being the guy who's going to stick with it because I've got no other choice. And the immersion technique was a massive benefit for me. Maybe you could just talk about it, because I love the concept.
Absolutely. I think immersion in 2 domains is really important, right? The first is, I used to think if I'm a rookie at something, I should just get somebody that's good so that I can learn from them, because it'd be a waste of time to learn from the best. And almost everyone that I've ever seen the best in their field follows a very different methodology. And that's the one I try and find now, is who can I think of that's the best in the world at that skill that I want to attain, and start learning from them. Because there's a couple of major advantages. The first is, I'm not going to end up picking up bad skills from someone that's average, right? Like someone that's good at it's going to be able to help a little bit, but like someone that's awesome at it. And in free fall, I'll never forget my first jump. They said, "Hey, don't tuck your legs, don't tuck your legs in, because then fundamentally you have a big front, little back, and you fly backwards to the sky." And so I jumped out of the plane, and we got to the bottom. He goes, "Did you tuck your legs?" I'm like, "No." He showed me their video. They were shoved all the way up into my neck, right? It was like, but I didn't know, right? But now I had an expert that was like, "Hey, try this next time. Move your foot 6 inches to the left," and it changed everything. And that allowed me to get within 100 jumps, because it takes so much time. You only get 1 minute of free fall for every jump, right? So you can't waste 60 seconds on one lesson, right? So then you get to the point where now I can learn 3, 4, 5 things all in a single jump, because that expert's tracking and can give me the perspective and feedback that allows me to learn the fastest. And so first is, find the best in the world, and find a way, and this is the part of the magic, find a way to make it worth their while. And Dwayne, you were there for one of those key transformational moments for me when we joined the Platinum Partners. And I remember looking around the room in awe, look at all these extraordinary business people. And I thought, well, I don't have any business acumen. So I'd gone up to many people and said, "Hey, can you teach me about business?" And of course, these are extremely professional, prolific individuals. And so they're like, "Okay, is there an exchange for that? Like, do you know anything in business?" I'm like, "No." And so just about, the first 10 people said, "No, I really don't," they kind of blew me off and didn't want to have a conversation. And then Dwayne, you and I had a conversation that was like, "Man, I can't really connect to this group because I don't have any business experience." He's like, and you said, "Hey, I don't have any experience in business, but I've got some experience in combat. So I'll share some of those truths if you'll share the truths with me." And then everything changed, right? But when I showed up small, they couldn't see me. And so that's part of that white belt. Like, in the domain that they're the expert, I'm going to listen with astute attention and pick up everything I possibly can. And then when it's the domain that I'm an expert, I'm going to provide as much context and perspective to them as I possibly can. Because one of the things that Dwayne, you and I have talked about, but it's crucial, is we all tend to overvalue what others have and undervalue what we have. And when I wasn't able to show up coherently as I'm committed to this path and learning, and I'm also committed to your growth, then that was one of the things that was held me back substantially. So like that immersion that you're talking about, the ability to find that person. And then second part of the immersion for me is, I'm calling it acceptance versus ownership. And so acceptance to me is when I'm accepting, like when you said dabbler, that's what happens for me when I dabble. I'm accepting that this is the path we're on and this is what's happening. And ownership is when I'm going to say, okay, I understand the environment and I'm going to engage with radical hope. I'm not going to be blind to any of the current circumstances, nor am I going to lose hope or faith that I can accomplish it. And so part of that immersion, the only way I can have that complete commitment to immersion, if I'm also fully committed to the outcome. Now, you and I have lived together for 12 years. You know that I haven't always hit the initial outcome that I thought I was going after, right? The universe stepped in, I got different outcomes than I thought, but the full commitment to the outcome that was the most likely to be my calling at the time was what allowed me to learn the lessons that allowed those outcomes to continue to shift and continue to move. So to me, it's that immersion and that full commitment. And it also leads to a full surrender where if the path changes, I'm not going to stay committed to the objective I thought I was on because it may be very different now.
Well, I think that's the gift, right? That's the blessing that most people don't absorb is life doesn't give you what you want, but it'll always give you what you need. And so you learn and you grow by the things that push you the most. And and even reflecting back on that conversation, it was at the top floor of the Hyatt at that party and in San Diego, I think, if my memory serves me correct. And I think you're being really nice about what I actually said to you, because I think it was probably more along the lines of, that is a fucking bullshit story. I mean, you're a commander of SEAL Team 6, you have in leadership and experience and living in the world of uncertainty, what these people couldn't experience in 6 lifetimes in business. And that's the coolest part is like, and this, as you were talking earlier about learning from the best, one of my reflections as you were talking was, in business, and maybe this is a presupposition and my hallucination may be incorrect, but in the SEAL team, big budget, lots of resources, military, all that kind of stuff, elite fighting force. So I'm assuming you guys are getting, the budget that you need to get the best training in the world. And in business, one of the mistakes I made all the time, and I think I still catch myself making this mistake too, is getting instruction and coaching from the best in the world is expensive. And sometimes I would see it and still sometimes see it as an expense rather than an investment to catapult myself, 1, 2, 3, 4 years ahead. Is it a correct assumption? And B, when you got into business, do you feel the same way?
Yeah, I think the most sophisticated answers will have polarities as we play with them. And so I'd say yes and no, right? Yes, in the military, it was externally provided resources that gave us the ability to afford that training. And in the civilian world, as an entrepreneur, it's the resources I can garner and muster. And so I would say we actually have infinitely more resources because if I'm only constrained by my creativity, but I have had, specifically in the early years when I was starting out, where I felt like, I was working with General McChrystal when I first left the SEALs. And so working with one of the most accomplished 4-star leaders and one of my heroes, and then when I broke off on my own, like, okay, Commander No Name, right? And so when my story was, I have less resources, I have less brand, I have less reputation, then I accepted less. Then I accepted, and I almost crashed a couple of my companies thinking, I shouldn't go talk to the CEO. I'm not worth talking to them. I'm going to talk to the director. I'm going to talk to the manager. I'm going to talk to a couple of layers down. And the truth of it was they couldn't understand what I was trying to provide to them because that wasn't their role. Right? So I had to get to the commander. I had to get to the founder. I had to get to the person that could make the decision. So I had to shift who I was to do that. And now I have infinite resources to get to anyone I want to. Right? And that's one of the fun part. My belief has shifted now. It's like, who do I want to get to room to? And then how do I get in the room with them? I think fundamentally when they say, if you take it back to the SEAL analogy, what's the difference between SEALs, and then the tier 1 when you're at the development group, when you're at SEAL Team 6? Well, in the SEALs, if someone said they said no, we would accept that as, okay, they said no. And when I got to SEAL Team 6, we shifted to, they said no. We'd say, okay, who are they? What's their name and what's their address? Right? Because all of a sudden it was, okay, if that's not legal right now, who makes the law? Let's talk to Congress. Let's change the law. And it's that shift in belief from someone provides an upper limit, and now I'm going to go, whatever it takes, I'm committed. And so I'd say now I have infinite resources because it really comes down to whatever I can create. And a lot of times for me, it comes down to creating triangles, because there's often something someone values, there's something I value, and there's something someone else values, and we all value those things differently. And so if I can find a way to, like when I first built the Broadway Fund, I was terrible at raising capital. And so everything I did to consult, because it was valuable to people that I provided consulting skills, everything I did to consult, I just put into the Broadway Fund, because that was the easiest path for me to raise capital at the time, was to actually just provide my own capital from services. Over time, it became inefficient and became, okay, how do we grow faster? We now have a track record. We can now do things differently. But for me, if it comes down to the only way out is through. And so much like you and I've talked about, Dwayne, the obstacle is the path. And all of looking back, I'm on version 12 as you've lived through me, but there's 12 different versions of me where I can look at moments of inflection where I went through a crisis, and it'd been very easy to either, check down or surrender. Right? And check down means like, I say, this is too much for me. And I leave the space and I abandon whatever I was committed to. Or surrender, which is, I don't know why I'm here. Many times this is the worst nightmare I could have ever had, and I'm going to continue through. And so that surrender part is the piece that I think is so crucial to allow each of us to become the person we're destined to be by letting go of the person we thought we'd be.
So it's funny. So as you were just saying that last piece, and you say, check down or surrender, but I mean, that's a psychological shift. In between those two, I would suggest that there's another psychological space where people will fight. So like there's check down, fight. Well, check down, accept, fight, or surrender. And surrender being, the highest is just like, here's what the universe has provided me. I'm going to live with it and follow the path. And as, in Michael Singer's books and, but, I'd be curious, because coming from the military background, I mean, I know me, for years, and you were, I think you were on that call years ago where I was like, I need more fucking joy in my life. And it was like, I'm a fight through kind of guy. And it was hard for me to surrender, and it took a long time for me to learn it. And I wouldn't say I've learned it. I would say I'm, practice in motion and looking for progress. But, for me, it was always fight. Was there any of that transition for you, or?
Yeah, no, I think your metaphor is much more complete. I tend to go to the poles. And so I think you're absolutely right. Like, to me, check down is the worst thing you can do. Full surrender. And we should define that. Surrender is not in any way giving up. It is more giving up to the outcome that I had planned in order to continue with everything I believe in all my intuition and everything I can get from my community. And we'll make sure we talk to community in a minute as well. But it's in no way like shutting down. It is letting go of, my commitment to my outcome and instead following the path. And then, yes, I think you're absolutely right. There's acceptance, which is kind of the apathetic response, which is less than check down, which is kind of that leads to status quo, which is really not an option for me. And so that one, I think you're right. And then the fight piece is often my first response, right? And I would love to tell you I accept things faster, but and ideally I do now. I think, part of the community we built, with the honey badgers and, the network of unbelievable humans that I now have in my life. I think my transition from fight to surrender is maybe 10, maybe 100 times faster than it used to be. But it used to be I would fight the outcome, and I can feel that for me, I'm kinesthetic. So it's like constriction of chest, right? That's what I feel like when I'm fighting an outcome and I don't like where it's going. For me, it's a complete constriction of my ability to breathe. And so that's my kinesthetic awareness I didn't have for years, but that's now I'm in fight, right? And so that helps me to get to how do I let go of that and how do I get free? Like before, knowing that we're going to get to share this with who knows would get a message today that was important to them. So this morning, it was a full hour ritual of different practices to both reset my neurology, right? With kind of the Wim Hof breathing you and I played with, then into meditation, and then into a manifestation creation meditation. Because to me, the stack of those three is what's required for me to be in an ultimate state to be able to have this conversation at a level that ideally will find and serve someone at the moment that they need it. The practice to be able to show up for this crew, right? Because I was just leaning into, like, it's a ritual for all of us. And I think you called out very well, like, the two middle phases that I had missed. So I was honoring that, like, yes, accept, fight, surrender, right. Trying to provide that. And then to me, the two paths that follow are like, how do you surrender or community, right? Because both of those I think we haven't gotten to yet, but are crucial. We're talking about the individual journey, but
yeah, they'll come. So, it's interesting because when you talk about the meditation and the rituals, how much for you personally does that play a role in your ability to overcome the fight mode? Because if that's, I don't want to say it's your emotional home. It's certainly my emotional home. And when you talk about it coming from your chest, I'm the same. Like I get it from a little bit up higher and I'm, just, it's a rage forward, but, how much was that process and how it developed and where you went with it and how long it took? And cause it's a journey.
Oh, wow. Is it ever? Yeah, I think it developed for me. The beauty was the crisis I had in combat, right? So when I was preparing for the SEALs, my greatest fear was that I wouldn't be enough and one of my men would get wounded. And so the crisis that I woke up to every morning was, how can I be ready for everything? Now, this isn't the healthy path, right? I'll tell you where I've gotten to now, but it used to be running from scarcity continuously, right? And so it was how do I get bigger, faster, stronger so that I can have enough skill set so that when I can be ready to answer the call for anything. And so that drove a quest for me that I had to subordinate the ego because I knew I didn't have all that sufficient on these shoulders, right? So that drove, I knew I had to rely upon the wisdom of the team. And if I could have the superpowers of that entire team, and even more if I get the superpowers of that everyone that team knows, then all of a sudden we could learn at a rate as an organism, as a cohesive team that would be faster than anything we ever could have done ourselves. And my joke always used to be, if you only have a hammer, the whole world looks like nails. And when we only had SEALs, then the whole world looked like nails, right? And you get a lot of the fight response was kind of the solution that you get to something as you might anticipate. And as we started to move into the Joint Special Operations Command, where all of a sudden now we had the best policymakers in the world, the best intelligence gatherers, the best technicians, like you had all these different superpowers. Now it got to the point where when you're sitting around that table, I'll never remember one moment we were in an embassy and all of a sudden it was like electric because you could feel, oh wow, if we don't have the answer at this table, someone here has a network that they're connected to that they can go get the answer to their question, right? Because for me, whenever something isn't working, I always ask, who isn't at the table that could have been here? Who, if they were here, would be able to provide that perspective? And then we try and go find them. Or ideally, if someone already knows them, then that gives it that comprehensive knowledge. And now you're moving back into where we started, which is now I'm getting an immersion from someone whose life expertise I never knew I needed until that moment when we ask the question and we go find them, we get immersed in their skill set. And now that's a new skill set that we can integrate into whatever team, whatever mission we're trying to accomplish. And so that's where those rituals started. I think they were all unconscious, just out of a burning desire to survive, right? Kind of the fundamental desire for the team to survive. And then over time morphed into how do we now, I got to go, with some of the most amazing operators in the world on dozens of targets. And I'll never forget one where we cleared the house And the officers are usually in the back of the train, so we'd gone through the target, and we were going to this little shed in the back, and we cleared the room, and there was this creature moving in the corner, and so I couldn't tell what it was, so I hit it with a white light, and it was like this little girl with Down syndrome or some type of disease that they just chained her in the garage, and I was just like, it just hit me like, oh wow, like everyone's doing the best they can with the resources they have. They didn't know what to do with her, so they put her out in the garage. And so I went back into the house, and yes, this was in fact a target that we were going after because they were planting IEDs, to kill Americans. But this is now how they were making $5 a day. And so I'm like, wow, we've built the skill set to take out any target. Now, how do I get to the proactive side of infinity? How do I get, or as we'd say, to the left of bang? How do I now start creating change before a crisis occurs? And that's really what drove me to business, because I found there was really kind of three massive domain levers for humans. There was military, which is fundamentally fight, the execution of policy after someone's made a decision. There was policy, which is how do we change the way we interact. And then there was business. And for me, policy felt like it moved really slowly, but business, I got to go way out as far as I wanted to, create solutions for people or whatever challenge I had before the crisis occurred, and bring that into reality. And so moving to that proactive side, as my mission in life has been to continue to see if I can get further and further ahead. Because any of us that have been in a fight, any of us that have been in combat or battle, or anyone that's been in an accident, when you see humans die, that everybody lost. Right? But there's also the truth that war and death is not the worst of things. For me, the worst of things is when you see that spark of light and hope fade from someone's eyes. Because that soul death to me is infinitely worse than any physical death. And so that's where, how do we help people to be able to live from their purpose and be able to move in the direction that they feel called to do? And so that's largely what helped to inspire shifting to policy, shifting into business, and then shifting to say, hey, how do we now create stories that allow humans to unlock their full potential? And for me, in a world of tweets and only a couple hundred characters of attention, the fact that I can get people for 2.5 hours while they're tapping their foot to listen to a story that is either about Greek mythology set in New Orleans, like with Hadestown, or Once in this Island, where it's a young woman of color bringing two different island populations together. If I can tell stories that allow people to have a common context, then all of a sudden my mission is, I used to think I was supposed to be the spark, and I thought, how do I help? And I think I was guilty of therapeutic aggression, right? Like, I need you to change on my timeline. And I realized that was just completely off. And so now it's, how do I tell a story and be the kindling so that if someone gets a spark, they go, oh, that might apply in my life. And Shakespeare was one of my favorite classes at the Naval Academy. I realized at the end of one of Shakespeare's plays, that massive sense of catharsis, like, oh, what do I see in myself that was in that character that I don't want in my life? Or what do I see that I want to integrate into my life? And so now I got role models and examples that I now get to integrate into, in that spark of, okay, what am I called to be? Where am I going now? Versus what patterns were I running that were just given to me? And that's really part of the entrepreneurial process, I believe. And where you started was, what do I feel called to create? What are the things I've always wanted to do that now I've had a series of life experiences that I can bring those to fruition?
So much in that answer. And, for the 15 years that, I think it's like 2008 we met, 2008, 2009. So it's like 14, 15 years. You and I have probably had, I could count on less than my one right hand how many conversations we've had about you in the military, really, like other than like surface stuff. But you did, I just want to circle back to in the very beginning, you had spoke about, this transition, with warfare to policy and that triangle. And I'm just curious, like in the military, and because I'm curious about the transition of like what you experienced in the military and then the transition into business, which, we'll probably, I'm sure, get to on this conversation. But the crisis of 9/11, how did that change the way you guys created missions, policies, procedures, execution, training, working together with communities outside of your own. Was that pretty significant, or was that something you guys were always doing?
Only significant between night and day. And I have to also say the paradox of, like, back to how it always was. I think, in periods of crisis, it's fascinating. You can measure it by physical loads, like World War II, Vietnam, World War I. Like, in every major conflict, the combat load of the average soldier drops to about 35 pounds, because that's really what you can really carry and maneuver, 35 to 45 pounds. In peacetime, it always goes up to like 200 pounds, right? As you try and take everything in the kitchen sink with you to be ready for every contingency. And then you realize, okay, that just doesn't work. And so, I would say from my perspective, I joined the Naval Academy in 94 and I graduated in 98 when I took the oath of office. And so we were largely in a 3-year training pipeline, because that's basically how long it takes to complete all that in the SEALs between buds and then your initial training for a platoon workup. And I was diving under a ship on September 10th of 2001. And I came up about 3 in the morning because I was on the West Coast. And by the time I got to my girlfriend, now my wife's house, all the phones started to ring off the hook and said, you have to look at the TV, you have to look at the TV. And, for the rest of my career, I never dove again. So fundamentally shifted from sea, air, land, where a lot of our work was, traditionally the SEALs were designed for maritime, all terrain, but maritime operations. And then we switched to everything in the desert because that's what was required of us at the time. And so I think we were coming off of, the SEAL community specifically, coming off of extraordinary success in Vietnam, largely working as an organic unit, largely just SEALs. And the world now required of us a capability that was far and away outside of the capability that we had as SEALs, right? You could be the coolest guys you knew, but if you didn't have helicopters to get you there, you weren't going to get there. If you didn't have, the permissions from the State Department, if you didn't have partnerships with the alliances of the country that you're going into, right? And so when JSOC and General McChrystal and Craig Nixon were kind of the two leaders that I know that really were instrumental in this, expanded it from this small we of SEALs to the we of the larger community, it fundamentally changed everything, right? Because the crisis we had was we weren't fighting nation states anymore, and so we simply weren't fast enough. I'll never forget when it came down to us that, the president had asked why we weren't doing more operations. And at the time, we'd gone from this 96-hour mission planning cycle on like 4 days. We cut that in half, so twice as fast as in history. We're now at 48 hours to drive a decision. The challenge was we are now going against a network. We're going against a terrorist network and not a nation state. They could make decisions within 8 hours. And so fundamentally, even at 48, we are still 6 times too slow. And that's where the crisis forced us to change. It forced us to switch and say, okay, we're not going to try and go all the way up the chain and come back down. That's impossible. We're going to provide context to everyone. So everyone has commander's guidance. Everyone knows here's what's required of you and here's what actions you should take. And then also we flattened it so that from the ground, the information came up directly to the leadership. And so you had the greatest context coming up to the leaders, and you had the greatest perspective going down to the troops. And so now, instead of going up and down, everything was done laterally. And when everything doing laterally, we got to the point where we could do an operation in 15 minutes. And so, as a much further down the chain as an outstation commander, I now got to the point where I could point at a screen and say, that's our target, and we could launch within 15 minutes. And so now we got to the point where we were doing, at the beginning of the war, 2001 to 2003, we were doing about 18 raids in a month. So about every other night, that cycle you saw within the 48 hours, we got to the point where we were doing 300 raids in a night with the exact same force. So a complete shift in our operational cadence and tempo by fundamentally releasing our ego because it was what was required.
So, I'm staying with this mostly because I think it just applies to business. I mean, the whole, crisis. If you're in business, you're dealing with crisis constantly. You have kids, you're dealing with crisis. That's just life. And so many people, and especially, it seems society now is driven towards, avoiding crisis and feeling like things should just be, peace and joy and happiness and no stress, and that's just not life, and it's certainly not where you're going to grow. So it's a really good example, I think, of, how you guys were able to shift from, being able to execute an op, every 4 days to down to 2 days, and then, every 15 minutes if you had to. How much of that, though, is based on, quality information and the ability to transition decision?
Ask me more about transition decision. So quality information is crucial. Although, like everything, I'll answer with a paradox, right? So like if you were to launch on zero information, then that's a complete waste of time. Like hitting a dry hole, you just wasted, you had 150 lives in the line, a lot of energy burned that you can't get back. At the same time, there's the analysis of paralysis where I'm waiting for the perfect solution set. And we quickly realized you're never going to have the complete solution set. And so for me, it all came down to that 50.001, 49.99. Like it was always a close call where do we have enough information to proceed? And a lot of times the debate, as we were getting ready for an operation was, okay, what are the potential targets we have? Which ones, if we're uncertain about, could we go and investigate, launch an operation, and then take that off the deck so we no longer have to allocate more resources to it? And which ones are the ones that are strategically important that we're going to wait till we get to 80, 90, 95% resolution? And so the goal was to try and maintain awareness and the mix. And if we waited forever for perfect, we would never get any more information. But if we went too soon and blew an opportunity, then you might never get it again. So it was a continuous balance, and I think that correlates directly to business, right? It's like I love ready, shoot, aim, right? Figure out the plan, start executing, and then adjust in flight, because there's infinitely more ability to shift with momentum than there is from what we might call navel gazing, right? Just kind of sitting there in the analysis of paralysis.
Yeah, don't let perfect get in the way of progress. I mean, I see it all the time in our businesses and with people I know, but it's incredibly restrictive when you focus on trying to have all the information and have 100% certainty before you make a decision, because you'll never ever take action if that's what you require. And so many people get stuck in that, realm of life with their relationships, with their kids, with their business. And it's a really great example. I mean, to think that you guys are, you're talking about a 1% off of 50-50 to go or not go. And those are decisions where people are either living or dying.
Absolutely. And they were never made lightly, but they were made with the knowledge that it was required.
Yeah, right. 100%. Yeah. And so then, as it evolves, in terms of working with JSOC and the other communities, just talk to me a little bit about how that flowed and where it transitioned and where the biggest learnings were for you at the time that maybe you didn't realize it was a learning, but 10 years into business or 5 years into business, you go, oh, wow. I'm taking this principle that I learned in the military. So many people, are working, they're working in a job, working for a company, and they undervalue the experience that they're getting in the moment. And they stop thinking about what the potential use could be for that. And they get stuck going, I have a real personal struggle with, I believe people should enjoy their work, but I think, this whole passion thing, do what you're passionate about, gets a little bit oversold. And you can enjoy a passion and you turn it into a business. And we've done that once before, and killed my it was killed the passion. So sometimes working and learning and growing with a company and making money to afford your passion is not a bad strategy either. And so I just see so many people get stuck in this place with not getting the lesson that they're currently experiencing. So it's a long-winded way to go back to the question, which is, in the moment in the military, as you guys were evolving, what were some of the things that later on down the road in hindsight kind of appeared from those experiences?
It's a fantastic question. I think I'd love to answer it three ways. So I would say first, if I answered it operationally, we really realized we could get to focus on and be the best of what we wanted to do as long as we helped enough other people get to be the best of what they wanted to do, right? And so it became crucial to, the used to be and General Nixon and I always chuckle about this, the gap between SEALs and Rangers, right? Like Rangers had the most unbelievable doctrine ability to plan, right? And so they would have these long palm cycles, and candidly, we never would have had all the technology we had. We didn't have their ability, palm size, the programs, office, and milestones, I think. But it's like they would go get a 10-year, 20-year budget cycle from the Pentagon for like all of the ISR assets and all the things that candidly we weren't looking out that far in the SEAL community. So right, their long strategic arm became crucial, and then we were really good at adapting at the last second, right? And so bringing in flexibility and into discipline and rigor, the combination of the two was unstoppable. I'll never forget the first time I went into the embassy, and fundamentally, the ambassador is the president of that nation, so nothing's going to happen without the ambassador's approval. And I went in speaking SEAL language. Like my at SEAL Team 1, my XO's name placard said, "Be brief, be blunt, be gone." And so I thought the most honest thing I could do is I walked in and said, "Sir, I've read your State of the Union. I've read basically his guidance for the embassy." I said, and I walked in, I'd highlighted, "Here's the three things I think I can support the mission that you've laid out. What do you think?" And he said, "No," and like kind of kicked me out of the office. I'm like, wow, what did I just do wrong? And so I watched all the other meetings that were happening. I realized all the other meetings, my meeting was like 10 minutes long. Every other meeting was like, 90 minutes to 2 hours. And then I realized that the way the structure was, the ambassador was kind of the diplomat, and the chief of mission, the deputy chief of mission, the deputy ambassador was the number two, where the sausage got made. And so I realized I also realized that in their culture, like your shoes and belt had to match. And so like I literally figured out all these different pieces. And so now I would go in to the ambassador's office, and anything before 2 cups of coffee in State Department language is a crisis. Anything that is a crisis, they should say no to. And so I would go in and say, "Sir, how was your weekend?" And if it was fantastic, then you could wait till 2 cups of coffee and get 100% approval. If I went in, the weekend was terrible, and say, "I'm not going to ask anything today," right? And so by integrating all those things in, and I would have my leadership would often be upset with me, like, "Hey, I need you to go get this approved," but I could rush to a no, or I could wait for a yes. And so like each of the cultures was so different. I had to understand what is their cultural difference. I'll never forget one of my conversations with the State Department, and said, "Well, that might be a little bit of an issue." Now in the SEALs, a little bit of an issue is like the lowest ranking guy goes and take care of it. In the State Department, that might be a little bit of an issue is like code for grab the parking brake, we're stopping, that's never going to happen, right? And so the differences, the nuances in language were crucial because we all spoke English again, but not the same language. And so learning to speak each person's language allowed us to go through the gaps in judgment. And so like, the nature of the SEALs, early on in the war, we would send the people we least liked to be our liaisons. Like, well, I don't like this guy, let's put him somewhere else. And so early on, the liaison duty was a curse, but then guess what? The people that you can't deal with are now representing you to your key partners. And so they all think you're like that guy, and so nothing ever got done. And what we changed to was the best leaders were the ones we sent to be our liaisons to represent us to the State Department, to the CIA, to the NSA, to any of our foreign counterparts. And when we shifted that, everything changed. Because now you were building bridges instead of detonating the bridges, fundamentally, when you were sending non-relational people there. And that changed everything in terms of cooperation, in terms of the information that got shared or didn't get shared, right? Everything came down to, if you needed one more piece of information to get across the threshold to be able to go after a target, but you didn't have that relationship, it was never going to happen. And so relationally, it was crucial to figure out, hey, if we have to be able to walk in another person's shoes in order to cooperate with them and strike up a collaboration. And I'll say, the one I saved for last, probably the most important for me, is the ability of bringing that clear, coherent energy field. And by that, what I mean is the ability to show up in every interaction so that every one of your partners knew, I'm showing up for my truth, I'm showing up from what I believe, and I will never, all of us or none of us, I'm never going to leave you in a lurch or any of my partners in a lurch. There are obviously things that are outside of control, but we were in it together, right? We were never, ever going to take an action that was disloyal to anyone else. And by doing that, you build that trust, because the SEALs fundamentally they do extraordinary superhuman things with very average humans. And when we did that across an even bigger community, we got an even greater outcome. That's why JSOC to me was such an extraordinary organization, because every single person knew how valuable they were. And the moment everyone knew how valuable they were, it changed everything. Because to your first point about working from your passion, I don't know if I can work from my passion, but I have to work for my purpose. And so for me, that's where, look, changing my son's diapers, if I think about it tactically, I'm like, do I really like changing diapers? No. But if I think about it like, for me, I love changing my kids' diapers, because I know there's going to be some moment when they're 16, 17, or 18, and they're about to do something risky that's beyond their experience. And I want to be able to say, I've got 12,000 diaper changes. Like, give me 15 seconds. Right? My ultimate purpose is I want to provide comfort. I want to provide love. I want to provide assistance to, a creature, a human that I love. And the fun part is, it's my favorite exponential part of the curve, right? Like, I changed my son diapers, and then that moment you cross that value of 1, and now he teaches me coding. The older 3, the younger 2 are still in the learning phase, but the older 3, there's a moment they came to me, I don't know, probably about 2 years ago, and they said, Dad, we're tired of you telling us what to do. We want to be a part of the decision process. And I was like, oh, of course. They're my teachers. So look, I haven't had a 14, a 12-year-old girl, a 10-year-old girl before. How do I be the best dad to you? And I'm blown away. They'll always provide bam, bam, bam. Like, okay, 3's good. 3's good. That's all I can take for today. But the insight and the perspective that they provide from my blind spots is mind-blowing. Right? And of course, there are some things that I think are now my wheelhouse of like safety and health that I think are crucial. But it's absolutely humbling when you realize how much we don't know. I went to a small high school of 68, and my assumption was my son's high school was like mine. And I was at his band concert 2 months ago, and the teacher's like, hey, there's the 20 kids in band of the 2,300. I'm like, he's in college. Like, his high school is as big as my college, right? And so, like, I hadn't grokked his experience, and he and I had a gap because I didn't understand where his struggles were, because I was imagining the world. My assumption was the world I came from. And when I was able to teleport my experience to match the world he was in, we were able to completely revamp our relationship and our engagement. But I had to get humble and stop assuming that I knew the answer. And so for me, that humility to be open, be vulnerable, be authentic, and learn, coupled with the courage to say, and here's what I feel is true, are those two other parts of that paradox that are the most powerful, and I believe that give us the guidance to do the thing to create the thing that hasn't been created, right? Because you're basically taking all the systems and experiences in your life and integrating that piece that is you to build something new and uniquely different.
How long? You're not picking these lessons up in the SEALs, or are you? I mean, are you?
It's a lifetime
maybe
journey.
A better question would be: are you realizing them in the SEALs? Because I can't imagine. I've had opportunity to meet some other SEALs and some of the Rangers. We met you had a bunch of guys down at an event. Not everybody functions at the same level. And good, that's good that they don't. But, how much of these learnings and distinctions are post-military and into your business career, and how much of them have influence by your kids? I know that my son is, I've always referred to him as my greatest teacher. Literally, I've had a ton of mentors, but I've always said my son is my greatest teacher. Being able to, see his life evolve, through his eyes is such a reflection on where I was and the lessons that I didn't get when I was that age that I'm seeing happen in real time. And you're going, oh my gosh, and I wouldn't have seen that, had I not gotten some great advice about, don't try to turn your own child into yourself, a mini me. He's been bestowed upon you as a gift for you to experience life through his eyes. And so I'm just curious, on your evolution, where did all this start to change for you? And as you came from the military and through I don't know how many deployments. I actually don't know how many deployments you'd been on. And then into business. And then I know that, we haven't even gotten to I think your business evolution is almost as chaotic as and steep a learning curve as probably the military was. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how it all just kind of flowed for you.
Well, I'd say for anybody listening to make sure they get that when you look back, when I tell you the story looking backwards, it looks like infinitely perfect flow that was designed this way. And it's implicit, and of course it couldn't have been any other way. And every single morning going forward looks like a gong show. So to make sure that
there's context to it.
I want to make sure that that they grok that when you look back, and to me we're all living lives of such grace that we can get into that place of grace, we can literally repaint the picture, and our mind tends to remember everything that's happened, but now from that place of certainty, because it's already occurred, that it doesn't have the uncertainty of going forward. And so I'll paint it, and sometimes people will be like, wow, what a miracle life. I'm like, it didn't feel like that at the time. And so, and when you say, which domain did I learn the most? For me, life is just a constantly expanding helix that you're kind of revisiting and getting new depth and new knowledge to lessons. I continue to think, wow, my mindset, my perspective has changed so much. And then I'll look back at something I wrote 10 years ago and something I wrote 20 years ago. And I was just looking at, the high school goals that my dad and I had worked on together. And there's a component where the apple does not fall far from the tree, right? The lineage that I've been handed across my lifeline, and I hope to transition to my children, looking at that long-term perspective, it's fascinating that there's not much has changed, and everything's changed. And so, I think, Dwayne, you and I played with, I think there's 3 major marriages in life, right? There's a marriage to myself, and there's my crazy roommate, and the conversations I'm having here, that is my mentor, Tom Crum, talks about. There's a marriage to relationship, marriage to really those intimate relationships in our lives, our wives, our spouses, our children, our intimate relationships. And then there's marriage to profession, and then that marriage to what we believe is our calling to bring to the world. And I think I used to have an equation that when people talk about work-life balance, X plus Y plus Z, let's say, equals 1, right? So if I'm trying to balance these 3 marriages, and if they're equal to 1, well, by definition, the equation puts them in conflict. And so that's what I often see in the world today, where if I want to optimize profession, what I achieve, what do I do? Well, if I eliminate relationship, I eliminate taking care of myself, then I can optimize that profession. But I think it's the equation that's wrong. And so, changing out that little plus sign for a multiplication sign changes everything, right? If X times Y times Z equals fulfillment, well, now everything's changed, because I have to maintain my center. I have to build my capacity. I have to be clean internally to be able to love another at the deepest possible level, right? And to be able to be connected in that dyad, in that deepest relationship. And only then can I truly experience many others from that core. And so for me, it's an expansion, and I can't abandon any of the three or abandon everything. And so, that's probably the most dynamic shift that's occurred across all of those domains, as I've spent birthdays I missed for my kids and birthdays I could have been home for loved ones. And I thought, well, I have to do this. And I always try and catch myself anytime I say I have to do this. I always go, what's driving that, right? So I try and get deeper into what's causing me to feel that way, because the truth is there's nothing we have to do. It's all what we get to do. And so that's really like our opportunity, and where I try and continuously get to that centered place. And that's how I can tell if I'm in a centered, powerful place, or if I'm in a place of scarcity. And my goal is to continue to spend more time in that centered, powerful place, because I know from the place of scarcity there can be only pain and conflict, right? And so our mentor talks about how do you transmute suffering into consciousness. And so the more conscious I am that, like, whatever that suffering is, it usually is from attachments I have. And you and I have been on this journey for a long time. There's many times in my life I thought, wow, I'm not attached to anything else. And now I've cleaned that up, and now I'm not attached to anything else. And I continue to be amazed at what I find that I'm attached to. And then when I feel like I'm clean, now I'm attached to feeling clean and not wanting to be attached to that. So it's been a constant and extraordinary and marveling process of continuously trying to say, how can I be completely present in the moment, not shameful about what's happened in the past, because I've made so many mistakes in my life. It'd be easy to just crawl underneath a tile on the floor and stay there forever, and not fearful of what's coming in the future. But if I can truly be present in the moment, then that's where, if this one special and magical life in this one moment, that's all we have. That's all we really have. And we have a continuous number of those, but being present to each one of them has eliminated so much pain from my life and given me so much courage to do the next, because I'm no longer worried about, I love the Kristen Bell from Frozen 2, the next right thing. But I'm not trying to map in my head the next 1,000. What's the next right thing and next right thing? Just like climbing a mountain, where each time, and then it's extraordinary looking back and there's this unbelievable view from this mountain peak. But each time was those little 100-meter increments that I was climbing up, that each time all I could see was the scree right in front of me.
How do you do that? How do you kind of create that space for presence? And what's the transition? Because so many people, I think, experience that. They feel this tightness, this have to, as I think, as you the words we use is, and then what was the transition for you to be able to get to that place? And I'm sure you're not there all the time, but when you get there, how does it work, man? Like how did you string along the pieces to go, okay, step 1, step 2, step 3 type of thing, or what are the rituals, or what's the process?
Well, it's more deliberate now. I would say it started for me in probably the darkest crisis, where my greatest fear in leaving the military was that if I wasn't there, I'd be abandoning my team, leaving my team, because I felt like I had a calling to go where I was going to go next, and if I left my team, I was abandoning them. And I was still active duty, but on terminal leave when Extortion 17 got shut down. It was the greatest loss of SEAL and special operations life I've ever had in a single moment. And I was so ashamed / distraught / just despair that I didn't have the tools to even know where I was, right? And that's where communitas, that community of people, like my mentor knew, my wife knew, right? And so it was people that reached out to pick me up before I even know that I needed to be picked up, right? And so then it becomes, for me, it just becomes from there just a continuous, pay it forward. Many of the transitions in my life that I have undergone, I would not have undergone were it not for a community, because they can often see what's outside the frame. And so if I were to kind of map deliberately when I go through a crisis, like, first I'll find the people that I know love and trust me, and I'll try and communicate that to them in as authentic and an embarrassing, I'll say that way specifically, an authentic and embarrassing way as I possibly can, right? So I kind of get the truth out there. Here's the situation I got myself into. And then there's really no desire for solving at that point. At this point, it's more like from a deep point of despair where I don't know if I can get my way out. Like, it's expressing to others and then allowing, and this is a hard part for, I'm a people pleaser. And so it's hard then to accept that love and support back. And so I'd say that was probably the first part that was the most difficult. And I only did because I had to, like, we're allowing others to love, support, and carry me, right? Because I was supposed to be the leader, and I'm supposed to help others, and I'm supposed to always have the plan. And so being vulnerable and open to say, okay, I'm going to be carried by others, right? I'm going to surrender to that which is beyond me. And then now that becomes deliberate, get into that phase. And then once I get to the point where I'm buoyed enough that I can get back to center through the support of others, then it becomes, okay, now how do we solve this? Right? So when I go through that valley of despair, and I think this kind of leads into one of the things I think is one of the crucial importances. I think there's 3 phases to life, right? There's the pre-tragic, where I think everything works if I just do the work. And when you're in the pre-tragic, being told about the tragic has no relevance to you, right? But when you get hit with the tragic, when you get hit with the thing that's far and away outside of your domain of expertise or anything you would have expected or anything that you did, then there's that moment where, okay, nothing works. And this is the most dangerous part of the journey, right? Because now every model I had up until this moment is lost because it did not prepare me for and was not sufficient for this moment. And then if you get the miracle of love and grace and support, then the other side of that, I believe, is the post-tragic, right? The post-tragic is where it might not work out for me, but I believe it ultimately works out. And in the post-tragic, that gives me the freedom to act, and I'm no longer in fear because, candidly, I'm all in the gratitude round because I could have been lost at the tragic phase were it not for the fact that everyone showed up to support me. And the post-tragic now gives me the complete freedom to act from a centered place of everything is grace from this moment on. Now, I'll lose that, right? And I'll lose that moment from time to time, but the further along I get, the older I get, the more grateful that I'm still here after all I've been through, and more just overwhelmed with grace for the unbelievable love and people that have been in my life that I can't even fathom what I could ever do to earn that. Gives me more freedom to show back up, and now out of grace, give back to others. Out of grace, create what I think I can bring to the world to make it better for them, for the generation that is there that doesn't even know they need it.
And it's beautiful, but and I at the very beginning you had talked about going and speaking your truth and speaking about your feelings, and I think you used the word making as embarrassing as you could. Mm-hmm. A lot of people that can't do that. And so, in my experience, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So, if I kick the door open, then it gives the people the opportunity to walk through the door. But in the beginning, so many people and you hear these tragic stories about people in the military who've suffered, unbelievably extreme traumatic situations that, most of us wouldn't see in our life. But people do see them in versions of natural disasters and all kinds of things that happen. violence, street violence, the process of you being able to admit and talk about it. And maybe in the beginning, I think you'd kind of said when that helicopter got shot down and many, many, many of your friends, I think wasn't there a dozen soldiers on that helicopter?
More.
Or more. And, probably at the time, I didn't realize how significant that was because I can't correlate, to it from my direct experiences. And the deep relationships that you had. But how do you learn and what were the steps for you or the realizations that allowed you to be able to start to be able to open that door, kick it open and be vulnerable enough to, as you say, tell it in the most embarrassing way?
Yeah, that's what I said the first time. I didn't have the strength or courage or knowledge of how to do it. They just showed up and did it for me.
Right.
And I can now say it is our own fear that we're not enough, our own fear that if people understand our weaknesses, our vulnerabilities, all of our flaws, our fear is that if they know those things, they'll reject us. And so we live these desolate lives of abandonment and aloneness out of our own fear. And part of it then comes down to well, do I judge others? Because we tend to think that if I know someone else's weakness, do I judge them? And so it's being open and present to, if I can be open and present to accepting that all of us have flaws, weaknesses, that's actually, I forget where the quote came from, but I think it's the Japanese art where when they crack something and they bind it with gold. And thank goodness for all of our cracks and flaws. That's where the light gets in. And so, to me, it is that grace of, I happen to I don't know if I would have got there first, right? I don't know if I would have found the path were it not for it was shown to me first. But once that gift was given to me, I can't not give it to everyone I possibly can, right? Because it to me is that unconditional love, that grace that allows us to see, hear, and understand others. And then what's amazing about humans is to be seen, heard, and understood by one other changes everything, right? To feel like we're not alone in this echo chamber and there's 7 billion people on a different frequency, but all of a sudden you've got your community, you've got your people, you've got, and now the bigger we make the greater the global health gets, right? For me, the moment we ever get to the point where we all can't hurt any of us without affecting all of us, then everything changes because our context, our perspective, our judgments, and it's really updating and evolving our models. Because we've all been, I think, in those moments of where you're in community and there's nothing like it. There's no achievement, there's no reward, there's nothing like feeling like you're seen. For me, feeling like I am seen, heard, and understood and held in community with another.
Yeah, and I think the thing that screws up community is yourself. I have a Post-it note. The only piece of paper that I have on my desk, by the end of the workday, I'll clean my desk up. There's one piece of paper that never leaves, sits at the base of my computer, and it says it's one of those recipe cards, and it's in red writing. That which you resist the most in others is what you have yet to accept in yourself. And to your point here, it is when I feel, so the process that I kind of created for myself was when I start to feel that resistance, right? That judgment that somebody says something or something does somebody or they're, even if I'm being served, customer service rep or whatever, and they're doing something and I can just start to feel it, and that judgment that starts to come up, that resistance that I start to feel, then I reflect and I reframe that statement in my mind and and say, okay, what here am I not accepting in myself? What in this interaction, and it helps me to not judge. What was it for you? The other one, sorry, while you're thinking on that, is the other one for me was, the phrase, you can either be right or you can be rich, but you can't be both. And rich not meaning money, monetarily, but it's rich in my relationships, because whether you're in business, whether you're raising your family, whether it's a SEAL team community, whatever it is, it's a series of relationships. I mean, that's everything that we're doing in life is a series of relationships. And so, those two pieces are the ones that, I keep recycling in my brain whenever I start to feel judgment or resistance kind of creep inside of any of my communities, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a nearly identical process to yours. For me, I try and differentiate between what's the fact here, what are the actual facts, and what's the story I've created. Right? In the moment, I can get present to what's the story I've created, and then I ask, is that the story that most serves me and the higher good? And oftentimes, the one that makes me angry is an assumption about someone, or an assumption about what's happening. Or it's me future pacing something that hasn't occurred. Somebody told me the other day, like, of all the crises in my life, like 90% of them have never occurred, right? And so it's like, our minds work so fast that we instantly project, like, here's everything that means. And instead of just holding the center and saying, okay, is that true? Is it really true? And I think that's Byron Katie's work that you turned me on to, that was, what if it wasn't true? And the moment I can give myself enough pause to come out of the certainty I get when I'm angry, right? Because there's that anger, sadness, uncertainty loop, right? And so, like, fundamentally, if I'm uncertain and I'm sad, then I love the rush it gets to be angry. Now, it may not serve me for the long term, but for the moment, I feel clean. That's why violence is so contagious, right? Because it, like, gives us that complete feeling of certainty in the moment, although it may not serve what we actually want. And so if I can give myself enough pause, and the biggest one is if it's important, I try never to do it before a night of sleep. I mean, of course, there's tons of decisions I have to make, and maybe it's a 15-minute pause. My one, if it's time critical, would be, can I take 3 deep breaths and get heart centered and make the decision from here, and making sure it's not, my crazy roommate taking a run at it. If it has the time, and if I can give it a cycle, then I'll give it a cycle. If it's really important, I'll pull together, my circle, my honey badgers, and we'll come together and find out, okay, what's the collective's perspective on it? Because I'm continuously blown away at, I think all humans make, including myself, make the best decision we can from the resources, from the options we see. And whenever I have a time to talk to people with different context and perspective to me, and particularly if they're outside the frame and they're not attached, that opportunity set explodes. And then when the opportunity set explodes, now I can choose the best choice from an infinitely greater set than the one that I initially started from. So kind of a threefold: immediate, short-term, longer-term perspective.
How do you set, so a couple of things. One, you mentioned the honey badgers a couple of times. So for people listening, that is our mastermind group that we created, over a dozen years ago. And it's an unbelievable resource. Those people who are in business, or anybody who's listening to this, highly recommend having a mastermind group. But I mean, it's one thing to have a group, but it's also, groups can also ingrain a thinking of linear thinking. So, gangs, violence, right? Significant certainty, spending time with the too many of like people doesn't give you perspective on different angles or thought processes towards a problem that you might be having. The worst thing that you can do most of the time when you're fighting in your relationship is go to some of your friends and they're like, you know, they just reinforce your way of thinking because you've created that group. So it's not just a matter of having a bunch of friends together. It's really getting outside perspective that's different, but it's also setting aside your ego to be able to understand that you might not have all the answers, that there are other people out there that have a perspective that adds value, even if it's not aligned with your way of thinking. So often I see people, and I see this in my son as well, you know, being 21, it's, you know, that difficulty to reach out to others who might be able to have an answer for you that could evolve your thinking or streamline your process or systems, and make it more productive, if you will. But there's a fear of not being smart enough, not being enough. I think you mentioned it earlier. Just curious if you have any perspective on that.
Yeah, on accountability groups and on deep connections, I think, where I feel, I mean, the crucial piece for that is having a standard. And I don't think I actually fully leveraged our group, you know, until probably 5 years in. I think there were others that led and were more vulnerable, and I always thought, oh, it's not my week, or it's not important enough yet, right? And in all of that was just ego for, I don't want to share vulnerably. I don't know if I'm comfortable enough with what I might hear. And so it wasn't really until year 5 where we really, for me, started to completely transform my cycles of life and my ability to iterate and evolve much faster, because I was getting context and perspective from an unbelievable source, and you know, the gratitude of how a group from, I don't know, 6 different nations happen to come across. So we have very different backgrounds, and then the only unified commitment is, you know, to each other, and therefore then it allows us to speak truth. And I love what you were talking about earlier. Like, there's a difference between colluding, which is, I want you to support me in the bad opinion I've come up with or the decision I've come up with, versus collaboration, which is, I'm going to provide you a series of perspectives. I'm not going to tell you which one to take, because the choice is yours, you know, but I'm not also going to reinforce the line that you of thinking you're on, because that's actually not a friend at all. That's really allowing them to go down a path that candidly, probably 3 or 4 critical decisions, either I wouldn't have had the courage to make, or I wouldn't have had the context to make them without bringing them to the group.
Yeah. And I mean, I struggled with this so much when I was younger, and I still struggle. I mean, it'd be a lie to say that I don't struggle with it today. That you said, like, in our group, it took you 5 years to, what was the shift for you? What was the light bulb that went on that really all of a sudden made it okay?
I hope there are people out there that have the strength for light bulb. Mine, I think, was, again, crisis. Like, there was a business crisis that I didn't have the ability to solve. When I looked at the decision set, I guess if I have one superpower, it's when I see a decision set I don't like, then I know I have to expand it beyond my little fractional knowledge, right? And now in almost every decision, I know that I have a tiny set, unless I can get to the people that know more than me or have a different experience than me. It's not a inferiority thing, but more a gratitude that there's billions of people on the planet. If I can get perspective from them, I guarantee it's going to be a better decision set than the one that I started with. And so I think it was a crisis that I didn't have a solution for. And so I brought it to the group, you know, and in utter shame that I could have gotten into this situation through, you know, fundamentally my own faults. I remember a dear friend saying, totally. He's like, it's really hard for you guys. And he meant for SEALs, for military people that come from a loyalty background. It's like, he's like, it's really hard for you guys. It's a horrible business decision, but I understand why you made it. You know, it's one of those things that it was so funny from a seasoned business perspective, from a contract perspective, it was a terrible decision. But it was a decision I made based on my word is my bond, right? And this is where one of the things I've learned is there can be my aspirational standard that I have for my deepest friends, and then there can be, hey, what are the ways I interact when people show me who they are? I believe them, right? So how do I now set up so that, yes, in the best case scenario, here's what works out, but in the worst case scenario, we've covered the downside. So I've started so many businesses without putting in place an LLC agreement, without putting a contract in place, because like, no, we're going to lock arms and we're going to be in the surf zone. We're going to go through this. And the reality is, if I truly want to honor that person, I want to set the conditions where if one of us, including me, doesn't hold standard, we can continue forward. And so, most of my time, and part of what I like to drive is I like to drive crisis. I like to set up crisis because crisis calls me forth from my limited perspective that I can do it. Unfortunately, in my life, I've been driven to my knees so many times, and I can say with joy, fortunately, because it forces me to get bigger than me. It forces me to get outside of myself and to get to the incredible collection of humanity and the knowledge and the wisdom of the giants that we've gotten a chance to learn from, like from decades and hundreds of years of books that we can read, to the peers that we get to be in 3D with and share. Here's the experience that's happening for me in real time, and the rich tapestry of, unbelievable that we've gone through this. Unbelievable we get to share this, and then on the backside, laugh about it. For me, the true sense of community is, if it's great times, it's awesome. And if it's terrible times, it's funny, right? Because it's good to be in community either way.
Funny after the fact. So, I mean, you've had several startups. You have Navy SEALs. You several startups. Highly successful Broadway fund that you guys are running right now. Where do you source the communities? And that's been a key word that you've used throughout our conversation here today. And where do you source communities? What communities are you involved in? Like, what are the most influential communities that you're involved in right now, and what led you to them, or how did you seek them out?
Well, communities, I really seek them identical to what we had in that first conversation, where, hey, who's got the skill set, or who has a signal that is most resonant with where I aspire to go to. And so the reason the Honey Badgers all met is because at the time, Tony Robbins had clarity and perspective on life that I know I didn't have. And I was at his leadership academy in San Diego because I was based in Coronado at the time. And I remember saying, hey, if you really want to take life to the next level, if you really want to build a community of like-minded people, join this community, right? And so I remember calling my wife and I said, hey, I need to do this. It's the only way I believe I can grow fast enough. Again, I was still in that scarcity perspective. It's the only way I can grow fast enough to potentially save the lives of my team. And said, I need to take everything we've got in savings and put it into this. And so this is where, that perspective you had on, do you have the resources? Any rational person would say we did not have the resources as a lieutenant in the Navy to join the Platinum Partners. And the good news is I didn't even do the math correctly, that I was going to cost $10,000 per trip as well, because I never would have done it at that point. But I joined that, and then, hey, here's this whole collective of people. And then inside of that, fortunately, I'll never forget when this gentleman that might look a lot like Dwayne grabbed me, and when you talk about, circumstantial events. We're in Egypt. We just had this amazing, I remember is in Israel, this amazing trip on meaning. And then we're about to fly to Egypt and we get fogged in Israel, right? Fog doesn't come to Israel. So we end up we're crashed there, laying all over the airport lounge. And, Dwayne grabs me and says, hey, you got a minute? And we turn the corner into this empty alley where there's nothing, an empty corridor where there's no one at. I'm like, I've seen this before. Here's fisticuffs. I'm about to get jumped.
Thought you were getting mugged.
And he said, hey, we're standing up this accountability group. We think you'd be, a great addition to it. Now, did I actually think I'd be a great addition to it? I'm like, I have nothing to add to these business people, right? Did I think, but that was where the fun part of one of my superpowers, I run at that which I fear the most, right? And to me, leveling up to join this group who I'd have to become, because I never would have done it for myself, but I would do it to make sure I could be present for my peers. Right? And that was the same thing that in the SEALs. Like I was on that mission because I was like, hey, how can I be a greater servant? How can I be a better leader? How can I be more present to lead this team in combat? And that was the same thing that drew me into the Badgers. And I continuously look for, another one of the Honey Badgers has built a community he calls the Argonauts, right? Fundamentally the seekers that are trying to move from purpose, and trust. And so like, that's a community that appeals to me. Like YPO community, the leaders that are now joining in Forum is by definition a conversations designed to be deep and vulnerable outside of the achievement culture, right? And so like for me, it's continuously looking for communities. I met my mentor on that right after that plane flight to Egypt. I met my mentor, Tom Crum, and now the community he's built with Magic of Skiing, and the people have now gone for 40 years, to this event, and the metaphor of skiing downhill and what that does for your life. So to me, it's looking for, hey, who has built incredible communities across history, right? I love looking at the Spartan history. We were just in Greece and got to go see the Battle of Thermopylae. Who has built the communities that have the values that you aspire to uphold, and then trying to learn from each of them. And I love, what are the commonalities? Because to me, principles are the things that are universal. So ideally today we're telling you things that are universal so that you can be building a tech company, a consulting company, you can be building, a consumer goods company. And if we're telling anything that's tactical, then it's likely not going to be useful for you. And so we're wasting your time. So our goal is if we can show up at the level of principle, it should be universal and apply across all domains. And those are the truths I try and find, because I think that's where you can have the greatest impact on the future, is by providing simple principles that allow us all to be better, right? For me, my whole discipline and calendar is, how do I make myself better than I am? Like, what are the humans I need to interact with? What are rituals that I need to bring into my life? What are the things that allow me as a human to be better than my individual default settings would be? And that's what I love about that paradox of discipline and freedom, right? Because I love the freedom to create and build, and I love the discipline of, okay, and what are the rituals that I have to maintain in order to be in a peak state to create? And to me, it's the fun part of holding that paradox. This is the crucial piece of building anything.
In the early days, how much of this was driven, or be it by purpose, or how much of it was driven just by pure fucking courage or pure discipline? It's at some stage, there's an evolution, but where does it begin? Because that's where people are stuck. People are stuck at the beginning. Once they get momentum, they get confidence, they can kind of get it going. But what drove you to reach out to these people? What drove you to, say yes to us? You very seldom say, like, you're all in. It's like Leroy Jenkins, here we go, we're on. And you don't often say no, but where does it come from? Lack of feeling, like being okay with failure. I always said, my son would say this, and I've told him this a million times since he was a little kid, is like, we'll go to do something, and is this going to work great? Or we're going to fall on our face and it's going to be a great story. One way or the other, we're going to get something out of it. A good story or a great result. And that's kind of how I looked at it. But how did you look at it? Was it like, where did it come from in the beginning?
It's a great question. It's interesting to reflect. It's always hard to reflect where did it start versus kind of where is it now. I think as a people pleaser, I'm fundamentally a people pleaser. I'd say we're a recovering people pleaser now. But as a people pleaser, I always had a extraordinary sense of everyone around me. And it started, I had no value to myself. And so my whole goal was the only value I'd have would be how I could make others feel, how I could be present to or serve others. And so that hypersensitivity allowed me to figure out, oh, this person needs this or this person needs that. And so like it was an ability to learn rapidly, and I didn't worry about failings. I didn't assign a value to myself as it was, so I wasn't really embarrassed. I wasn't trying to hold on to something that I didn't have, right? So I was just trying everything and continuing to iterate as rapidly as possible. I think I've always had a scarcity about time. And so I was like, well, if I can get one lesson a year, then I might only get, my assumption is I'll go to 100, like I only get 100 reps. So how do I shorten that cycle? Do I get 12 reps in a year? How do I shorten that cycle to where I can get a rep a day? And so similar to yours, like to me, there was the book Failing Forward, but for me, I use the word failing because I think that's what's most present in today's, the feeling that something that didn't go right is a failure. But for me, it's always just been how do I learn faster, right? If I get more data points, as long as I'm not dead, then I have additional context for the future. It's what I loved in combat. If we're doing 10 operations a night, people are getting, an operation a year. All of a sudden, the learning that I'm getting is so accelerated that it gives me perspective and context that now that flywheel starts to turn, and now I can do things I never could have done before. So I think it started as people pleasing, moved into, the achievement perspective of how do I do more, right? It was achievement and love as how do I protect my team and how do I do more? And then I think now for me, it's in my best days, it's a pull toward a calling. It's a pull toward a calling to where, can I be a shining example, to my kids? Can I build businesses that are shining examples to the way we want to run business for the future? Like, I love the challenge of, can I make the impossible the inevitable? And so that's one of my fun drivers of how do I take, if you said, hey, we don't like the current monetary system, I love the fact that we can take transactional energy credits, money, and when we find a platform, now it's the purest conduit of unconditional love I can see, right? When you see actors and actresses on stage, if they're congruent, it is for me, I can only tell if it's authentic or plastic, right? But if it's congruent, you can give people an example of, here's a coherent field of energy of love that you may not have felt, but once you've seen it, you're fundamentally changed for it, right? Once the mind's expanded beyond, a new perspective, then they can say, how do I bring that into my life, right? And I think anytime we can see something that's more pure, more clean, more beautiful, more light, now we have a model that we can help build to that in our own lives. And so that's really, I think now it's the calling, but I think it started as how do I exist? And my existence was how do I serve others, because I didn't hold any value to myself.
So therefore you would often not say no,
Well, so the only existence was to help serve someone else. And so like if as a people pleaser, I could feel everyone else's pain. I could feel all of it. And it was like, okay, how do I help solve some of that? Because that seemed like the only thing, I guess that calling has always existed. Like, how do I make life better? How do I make life more joyful? How can I make this situation even more joyous?
I love that statement. I love that statement you said earlier about failing forward. If I could, I talk to so many kids, and when I say kids, people coming out of university, starting their career, especially we have a lot of friends that have kids that age and same age as my son and my daughter, who's just turned 18. My son's 21. And, they're trying to figure out what they want to do. And they just have this resistance to failure. And they see that the smallest mistakes is a big failure to them. And if I could transplant into someone's brain to not see failure as just an opportunity to learn, you skin your knees, get up, get going, move forward, stack that on the next one and on the next one and on the next one. And where you'll be in 10 years is like, I think you said it earlier, coincidentally, which is, if you look back in the rearview mirror, it looks like it was a perfect journey. It was
perfect plan.
Hey, Plan that perfect. Hit the mark. But when you're going through it, it's chaos and anxiety, and it's like, I hate using the word anxiety. It's anxious moments. It's I mean, everybody feels anxious. I get anxious, but yeah, it's an interesting analogy. What else you got going on? I'd be interested in having you back on the podcast, but I'd also be interested in you sharing with listeners how they can find you if you'd like to be found.
Absolutely.
I know you do some speaking, not often, but if it's the right kind of fit for you.
Yeah, I guess for me, the overarching component the overarching theme that's developed is I've always been passionate about how do you shift human consciousness? How do you help humans to wake up? And not that I think we're asleep, but I love, like, for me, it has felt like continuously more alive, right? If I was partially alive and running a machine and running a pattern, and now it's okay, am I living a life by my design? So how do I help humans to become more alive? And so there's that spectrum runs across, like, okay, I think in today's world it's become very difficult for us to influence each other directly. And so for me, like, a friend told me, like, nonfiction, you get to tell the truth about events, but fiction, you get to tell the truth about the humans. And so I love stories and narratives that allow us to call us forth. So that's where we started with Broadway. When we were closed for 744 nights, not that we were counting, we said, how do you keep Broadway open when it's closed for pandemic? And we said, hey, could we now turn Broadway to film? And Hamilton really changed the way people thought about Broadway, and, as it brought it to the screen in a new way. And that was a moment where now we can for me, the tragedy is these shows, like, you get to be in a coherent field, 1,200 of your closest friends, but when they close, there was no recording of it. So now doing live capture of those stories, and if you're not going to be in the theater, 1,200 of your closest friends, how do you ensure you get some of that coherent energy back? And so, for us, we try and have 32 different cameras and say, if it's something that's close in up front, you're right in the front row orchestra, so you can see it. If it's something that's huge and expansive, now you're back in the mezzanine, so you get to have basically the omniscient theater goer. You get to see it from every single perspective. And then, that's where you lay the groundwork for transformation. And then for the people that find that kernel of, like, oh, hey, here's one to explore, getting into direct conversations, whether it's through sharing truths in a presentation, whether it's through coaching, whether it's through backpacks back into nature. To me, all of those things are now like the options, so that if to me, if there's a burning fire, you got to get humans out. And so, like, trying to have the complete array. So any conversation, I'm not trying to get you into any one bin, but I'm saying, oh, maybe this will serve you, maybe this will serve you. And so that's really the fun journey, is how do we help each other live with grace, right? How do we live with that unconditional love that once we've touched it, once we've been exposed to it, it changes everything. And so, yeah, you can always reach out to me Dwayne always knows where I am, but you can always reach out to me at Curt@tvdtheatricals.com, or my cell is 619-227-7706.
Ooh, put your cell phone out there. You're courageous. Dude, it was awesome chatting with you. You're coming back, eh? We got to have you back on, and there's so much more to talk about. We've left a lot on the table. Really can't thank you enough for being here, man.
Thank you. Thanks for all you're doing.
Appreciate so much, man. We'll do this maybe in a month or so, and get back together.
All in. Anytime, any place.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks, brother.